Disneyland's Haunted Mansion is widely considered to be one of the greatest dark rides in the world, utilizing a bunch of different illusions, and at the time of its opening, groundbreaking technology. It's no wonder the attraction has managed to survive as long as it has. But what most people don't know is that the ride we see today is very different than what it was supposed to be, as little as 3 years before it opened, and how the very idea of what the attraction would be evolved countless times throughout the 12 years it spent in development. So with this video, I wanted to explore the ride's history leading up to its opening, and really figure out how it went from a traditional 1950s walkthrough ghost house into one of Disneyland's most iconic attractions to date. So, to do that, let's take the story all the way back to its beginning. The earliest version of what we know as the Haunted Mansion can be traced all the way back to 1951, with the drawing done by Disney artist Harper Goff. This was back in the days before Disneyland even existed as an idea, when Walt was interested in opening a smaller Mickey Mouse park across the street from his studio in Burbank, some of the first sketches of which were done by Goff. The first piece of concept art involved a church, graveyard, and creepy old house on a hill overlooking them. At the time, this wasn't more than just a basic idea for some kind of haunted house attraction, no real plans for it beyond that. Of course, when the Mickey Mouse Park idea grew, and eventually became Disneyland in Anaheim, the haunted house concept came with it. Now set to be at the end of the park's main street, a new version of the house was drawn up by Dale Hennessy that still looked very similar to Goff's original design, just now without the church and graveyard attached to it. This new Main Street house could also be seen in the first mock-up of the park's layout in 1953 by Herb Ryman. But at this point in its development, the mansion wasn't more than just a creepy-looking house. And considering the fact that Disneyland was set to open in only 2 years, new Main Street plans were then drawn up. Now without the haunted house because it just wouldn't be ready in time. For a while after Disneyland's grand opening in 1955, the house was still planned to be a Main Street attraction, only now a little behind the rest of the street on a creepy, more isolated offshoot, but none of these ideas were ever officially put to paper. It wouldn't be until around 1956 that the house saw another design, this time done by Sam McKim. Initially, as just a very basic sketch, he later fleshed out the idea a bit with a more detailed version of the building that now appeared much more dilapidated than any of the previous versions. This new idea was also created around the same time Disney was considering expanding the park with its first brand new land, called the New Orleans Square. A tribute to the real New Orleans, but with more of a focus on the historic aspects of it. Specifically, its pirate lore, which would be represented by a rogues gallery wax museum of famous pirates. The same idea that would later evolve into the Pirates of the Caribbean boat ride, but that's its own story. With those plans in mind, the redesigned McKim Haunted House was now set to be a part of this new expansion, located on the far left side of the land near the waters of the Jungle Cruise. And, with a more permanent spot now settled on for the attraction, work finally began on what would actually be inside the house. Really, the first Imagineer who can be credited for coming up with scene ideas for the Haunted Mansion is Ken Anderson, who Walt himself put on the project in 1957. Initially, he was tasked with creating some kind of storyline for the attraction, and ended up creating a couple. Anderson envisioned the ghost house as a walkthrough attraction, where groups of 40 guests would be led through the house by a tour guide, going through different scenes that would showcase ghostly effects. He then drew up a bunch of concept art to go with his story, along with an actual layout that we'll be using to get a better idea of the original walkthrough. The story begins outside the mansion, where you go through a small courtyard and loop your way back into the house, where after entering you find yourself in the portrait gallery, now accompanied by your tour guide named Beauregard, who explains the history of the mansion and that its previous owner, Bartholomew, was a retired sea captain, rumored to actually be an ex-pirate, along with how him and his wife, Priscilla, eventually both disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and the house they lived in is said to be haunted. From there, a hinged bookcase would open, revealing a secret pathway into the next few scenes, including a pirate at a table, which likely would have been the reveal that Bartholomew was indeed the deadly pirate Captain Gore, and the next scene after that, titled Wife at Chest, where we probably would have seen Priscilla discover the truth about Gore. It's also explained by the tour guide at this point that Gore killed her once she found out about his past, fearing that she might tell the rest of the town. Past that, now at the back of the house, we can look out a large window into a swampy bayou and see a ghost of Gore's ship out in the distance. The next scene after that would have included the captain sleeping in a bed, with our tour guide now explaining that he doesn't get too much sleep ever since his wife's passing, as a ghost of Priscilla appears and Gore shoots at it. Finally, you would enter into a room and look up to see that Gore eventually hanged himself after years of being haunted by his wife. While this storyline was the most solid out of Anderson's early ideas, there were a few miscellaneous other ones too, like how in those same floor plans you can see something labeled hands. This was actually related to another of his concepts, where a recurring character throughout the house would be Harry the Arm, a disembodied arm that would reach out and occasionally grab at the tour guide and guests. There were some plans at one point to maybe tie the arm into the attraction's storyline, with it being the cause of Priscilla's death, but that idea was ultimately scrapped by the time Anderson came up with the Captain Gore backstory. Over the next few months, Anderson's concepts evolved a bit more as well, expanding with new scene ideas, all of which later culminated in another new layout for the walkthrough. Now much larger than the original, this house featured all kinds of new scenes, like a grand entry hall with a spooky winding staircase, a revised portrait gallery, a much larger graveyard scene that was visible through a window, and a great hall/ballroom area with a ghost playing the piano. But none of these were really attached to a real cohesive storyline like before, mostly because of the fact that at the time 2 more ideas were then suggested by Walt that Ken was now trying to somehow incorporate, one of which being a tie-in with the 1949 movie The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, wherein you would see the Headless Horseman somewhere in the attraction, and also another tie-in featuring the lonesome ghost from the classic Disney cartoon, an idea that you can still catch some glimpses of in a few of the layouts for the house, but ultimately none of these ideas really stuck. Around this time, he was also facing the issue of capacity. With Disneyland's quickly rising attendance throughout the late 50s, a walkthrough attraction would have been especially difficult to pull off, given the fact that it doesn't move guests through it like a ride would. So Kent began to drop some ideas for a conveyance system that would cart people around the house at a set pace to get a higher number of people through it per hour. This also spawned another idea for the attraction, wherein Walt Disney purchased a real house called the Bloodmere Manor from New Orleans and relocated it from Louisiana to Disneyland with hopes to repair it, only to find out that the house was actually haunted and any repairs they made to it were undone by angry spirits that same night, leaving a decrepit and ghost-filled mansion right in the middle of the park that you could explore. This new storyline coincided with a redesign done by Anderson. Based off the real-life Shipley Lydecker house, the building now had a classic antebellum style to it, with an overgrown front lawn and boarded-up windows. This sketch was later turned into a full-color painting by Sam McKim and presented to Walt, who surprisingly rejected the idea of a run-down house, instead wanting the mansion to appear pristine and fit better with the rest of the New Orleans square. Not long after that, Ken ended up leaving the project altogether in 1958 to help with animation on the upcoming Sleeping Beauty film, but development on the mansion wouldn't necessarily stop there, as a couple of other Imagineers, Rolly Crump and Yale Gracie, were still hard at work creating all the effects for the attraction. With a rough idea of what the mansion's storyline would be, based off the concept art that Anderson left behind, they were now working on ways to bring those same scenes to life, most notably using a centuries-old theater effect called Pepper's Ghost, which in practice is basically just a reflection of an offstage figure onto a piece of glass, creating a transparent version of that figure that looked pretty convincing if presented as a ghost, an effect they had been toying around with in model form for a few years now. And since Anderson's Captain Gore concept was generally thought to be the walkthrough's final storyline at the time, Rolly and Yale began to play around with that idea, in the process tweaking the backstory a little and also creating a pretty elaborate new show scene using Pepper's Ghost that I'll just let him explain now.
We also had a storyline of the sea captain that had supposedly drowned at sea, but he had murdered his wife before he went to sea, and he bricked her up in the fireplace. So we hooked up this whole thing to where we had this skeleton behind the fireplace because she was off stage, reflected, and she had a big kind of not a sheet, but some real sheer piece of material on her. Then we would bring the lights up on the captain, who was also off stage. We actually had him in a pan of water, and we had a shower that poured over the top of him. So all of a sudden, in the middle of this room, you saw this old sea captain appear, and then all of a sudden the water starts dripping off of him, and he had seaweed on him and everything. And then you would see the ghost of his wife behind the bricks light up, and then she would scream and come out with her arms, and then they both would disappear.
And it was the creation of scenes like that that really solidified Yale Gracie as the real mastermind behind the house's effects. While he was originally just trying to bring Anderson's concept art to life through different technology, he eventually began his own sort of experimentation, and in turn ended up spawning a bunch of new ideas for the mansion's storyline. Stuff like creating frozen shadows of guests on walls with luminescent paint, to making talking skulls equipped with microphones so they could speak with people, and even figuring out that he could make multiples of a ghost by projecting it onto a disco ball. Just all kinds of surprising little effects. And throughout the mansion's history, Yale was shockingly prolific when it came to creating special effects, as he ended up making dozens of them during his time on the project, but we'll get more into some of those later. By the time 1961 rolled around, Disney was fairly confident that the attraction was near completion, with the majority of its storyline already created by Ken and effects now in practice from Yale. All it would take were some final preparations before they could begin construction and have it ready in 1963, a date they were so certain of that it appeared on multiple visitor handbills at the time. From there, a final, cleaner-looking version of Anderson's mansion was redrawn by Marvin Davis, and shortly after that, construction began on the house's facade, along with the rest of the New Orleans Square in 1962. But they would eventually run into an issue, in the form of the upcoming 1964 World's Fair.
You might be wondering how an animation studio like ours got into the World's Fair business. And frankly, I've often wondered about that myself.
With Disney now involved in the fair, by signing on to create several attractions for it, a huge chunk of WED was now focused on developing those attractions. And, with a set deadline of 1963, pretty much all Disneyland projects were put on hold for the next few years. However, since they had already began construction on the mansion's exterior by then, that part did get finished by 1963. Of course, the actual show building, where all of its scenes would take place, wasn't there yet, and the house itself just sat empty for the next 2 years, as Imagineers were still working on finishing all their World's Fair attractions. It wouldn't be until after the fair was over that work would resume on the mansion, and with Walt eager to finally finish up the now 13-year-old ghost house, he would put another animator turned Imagineer, Mark Davis, on the project. In part to re-envision some of Anderson's older ideas, but also to come up with new storylines for all of the Yale Gracie effects. Towards the beginning of Davis's time on the attraction, you can tell that most of his sketches were really just rehashings of old Anderson concepts, whether it be a new version of the tour guide Beauregard, who was now envisioned as an old butler, or even his version of the Captain Gore character. All of his sketches really drew from the old walkthrough idea, with even the semi-retired Harry the Arm making a brief comeback that was just as quickly forgotten again. It wouldn't be until a while later that Mark, the same way Yale did, kind of broke off from the old walkthrough storylines and started creating original stuff that would eventually take the attraction in a whole new direction. But at the time, Walt Disney was still heavily involved in the project, and also dead set on keeping it a walkthrough attraction, not having to convert it from one into a ride, like they were doing with Pirates of the Caribbean. In his mind, keeping the house something you walk through yourself was still integral to the experience. So, when plans for the house's show building were being drawn up around 1964, that was still the idea. And since capacity was still likely going to be an issue, they planned to create 2 identical walkthroughs in that same building that were side by side, obviously allowing twice as many people to go through it per hour. It was around this same time that we can begin to see some elements of the final mansion begin to pop up, one of which being the actual name Haunted Mansion, which was now what the attraction was officially known as.
And Mark Davis is the master in charge of our House of Illusions, or what do we call it?
A Haunted Mansion.
Haunted Mansion and Supernatural.
Along with that, we can also see the first appearance of the attraction's opening scene, the stretching room.
What does, tell her about this thing here, will you, Mark?
Well, this is our elongating, stretching room.
Initially devised by Yale Gracie as a way to get people from the mansion's facade into its show building, the effect is really quite simple. Guests would enter in through the front of the house, which itself is just the shell for a giant elevator. Then, they get lowered down to the park's basement level, leave the room, and walk through a hallway that conveniently goes underneath the tracks for the Disneyland Railroad and into the main show building. And this is where Mark Davis really started to make an impact, by taking what was originally just a necessary conveyance system and turning it into its own scene. Specifically with the creation of these stretching portraits, a series of paintings that would elongate with the room, revealing that the characters were in more sinister situations. Of course, they all had a slight sense of humor to them, a real staple of Mark Davis's work, and something that could be seen quite heavily in all his art for Pirates of the Caribbean, where most of the drawings featured gags and were generally pretty lighthearted. Along with that, he also worked on the subsequent hallway into the show building, now turning it into a portrait gallery, an idea that was likely lifted from some of the original walkthrough layouts, where a gallery was meant to precede the rest of the attraction. And this is also where you can see another of his contributions, the changing portrait, a painting that would morph into something a bit scarier the longer you were in the room. For his first few months on the project, Davis was mainly just creating different versions of all these portraits, really just trying out a bunch of random themes and hoping to land on a few that stuck, while also designing the look of both rooms. But he wasn't the only one throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall, as Rolly Crump in the illusions department was also taking the mansion in its own very weird direction. The same way many of the other Imagineers on the project did, Rolly began to put some of his own ideas for the mansion to paper by sketching out a bunch of strange drawings, including stuff like an aquarium with ghost fish, chairs that would stand up and talk to people, and sentient gypsy wagons. If it wasn't obvious enough, Rolly was really going out on a limb with all these drawings, introducing a distinct surreal quality that nobody else really knew what to do with. Nevertheless, he still continued making new sketches, and eventually presented some models of them to Walt, who at first also had no idea what to do with them, but would later come up with something called the Museum of the Weird, an exhibit functioning as the mansion's post-show, where people could spend some time looking through Rolly's collection of strange artifacts, really allowing him to go off the walls with all his creations, which he continued to do. And with all these sudden changes coming about and new people now working on the attraction, the concept for its backstory began to shift a little, from the original Captain Gore storyline that everyone was still kinda loosely holding on to, into something a bit more vague, as described here by Walt Disney.
Where you're going to meet the ghosts. This is a little scale model now of the Disneyland area. You've seen this many times, but we haven't got the ghosts in there yet. But we're out collecting the ghosts. We're going to bring ghosts from all over the world, and we're making it very attractive to them, hoping, they'll want to come and stay at Disneyland, so we're putting in wall-to-wall cobwebs, and we guarantee them creaking doors and creaking floors.
Now, nobody is entirely sure where this idea for ghosts from all over the world came from, but it's largely thought to be inspired by the recent advancement of audio animatronics, a technology that Disney had really taken to the next level during the World's Fair, by creating one of their most lifelike figures yet with Abraham Lincoln, in a show that was so impressive and popular that it prompted the Pirates Wax Museum they were developing at Disneyland to now turn into a ride, featuring these new kinds of figures. And, not wanting the Haunted Mansion to be overshadowed technologically by that attraction, it too was now going to include animatronics that would be blended with the same older illusions that Yale had been working on. Plus, by generalizing the story beyond just the sea captain, the mansion could include a bunch of different characters, something Mark Davis took full advantage of while drawing some of the new concept art, now featuring everything from historic figures like Caesar to ancient Egyptian mummies and even Rasputin, who would have had his own changing portrait. And it was the creation of these first few pieces of concept art, reflecting the ghosts from all over the world concept, that really started Mark Davis on the path of creating more characters for the mansion that were just random, with some being humorous visual gags like the ones he did for Pirates, and others just being various spooky or supernatural situations. At this point, they had pretty much dropped most of Anderson's original ideas, and Mark Davis was now forging something of a new path for the mansion's theme through all these different drawings. Of course, that's not to say he didn't borrow a couple of ideas in the process. But before any of these new concepts could be presented to Walt for final approval, he would unfortunately pass away on December 15th of 1966, leaving the project and everyone on it in a kind of limbo state for a while, with no real clear path forward. That wasn't until 1967, when Disney had finally finished and opened Pirates of the Caribbean, allowing most of the Imagineers on that project to transfer over to the mansion, finally infusing the attraction with some much needed new blood. Some of the more noteworthy characters, including people like Claude Coates, who did all of the set and background work for Pirates, and Exitencio, who storyboarded and wrote the actual script for the ride. And with WED's new management wanting to get the ride completed as soon as possible, almost the entirety of Imagineering was now put on the project in some way or another, resulting in a veritable flood of new ideas for it, and a particularly interesting one coming from Claude Coates. Claude felt that the mansion should be a truly frightening experience and live up to people's expectations of what a haunted mansion would be. By taking it in the direction that Davis wanted, with mostly humorous scenarios, it just felt too much like Pirates and wouldn't give the house its own unique feel. The mansion Coates envisioned was dark and ominous, with haunted graveyards and dusty abandoned attics, not scenes that you were meant to laugh at, something Mark Davis quite obviously disagreed with, leading to one of the most famous splits in Imagineering history, with people on both sides of the project debating what the house's tone should be, funny or scary, causing even more ideas to now pop up, with artist Dorothy Redmond being one of the first to try and combine all of them, representing Claude's moody atmosphere in darker scenes while also allowing room for levity, where a Mark Davis concept could easily fit, even attempting to incorporate some of the surrealism that Rolly Crump was so fond of. But beyond just the attraction's theme, there was an even bigger issue to deal with. That being the fact that they still hadn't figured out a real solution to the attraction's capacity issue. And while the double walkthrough idea might have barely worked before, Disneyland's annual attendance was higher than ever by the late 60s, really canceling out the likelihood of that, or even Ken Anderson's moving platform idea actually working. So, Imagineers turned to a ride system they already knew was reliable: boats. And as crazy as it sounds, the idea did make sense. By using that same system from Pirates, it would not only allow for higher capacity, but also give the mansion a new theme, with scenes now set in the flooded remains of an abandoned house, half submerged right in the middle of this creepy looking bog. Something that fit quite nicely with the broader Louisiana theme of the New Orleans square, kind of representing the inverse of all the classy shops and restaurants in that area, by having this dark, ghostly presence in the surrounding swamps. But this concept was quickly abandoned with the creation of the OmniMover ride system, a new type of conveyance that moved continually on a track, giving the mansion its necessary capacity while also distinguishing it from Pirates and keeping the whole thing dry. With a reliable ride system in place, Exitencio began to put all of these loose ideas that everybody had thrown out together, and started to shape them into some kind of storyline, deciding what scenes to include in its blueprint based off most of the recurring ideas. Obvious stuff that had been around since Anderson's time, like a ballroom, graveyard, and seance scene, would all be included, especially since every single one of those ideas had been re-envisioned multiple times by almost everybody. They also decided to include some other, newer scenes too, like a strange corridor of doors and endless hallway, based off some of the more ethereal ideas that we saw from people like Rolly and Dorothy. Plus, some of the old characters would also make a comeback, like the bride for example. Now lacking any real story like before, she would now find place inside Coates' spooky attic, and her sea captain husband would only live on through a portrait and the ship weather vane on top of the house. And now with a better idea of the actual layout, X organized whose ideas would go where, famously combining both Mark Davis and Claude Coates' concepts together, with the first half of the ride, starting with the load area, being the foreboding, eerie experience that Coates wanted, and the latter part, with the ballroom and graveyard, being the more comedic version that Davis wanted. From there, all the best pieces of everybody's concept art were compiled, and used as the basis for a model version of the mansion, where the attraction really started to take its final shape, allowing everyone to get a better idea of what the ride scenes would look like. And, using that, animatronic figures based off Mark Davis's characters began to be assembled, and had all their faces sculpted by Blaine Gibson, who had previously brought Mark Davis's concept art to life for Pirates. With the bulk of all these figures created and ready to be installed inside the newly constructed show building, X Atencio took some time to add a few more finishing touches to the concept while everything was being assembled, still wanting to draw from a few of the older ideas that everybody else had left behind. Take, for example, something like Yale Gracie's idea of a pop-up ghost. With the mechanical side of that effect already in place, X would just have to finalize the design, get someone to sculpt a real version of it, and bam, you've got another new piece of the attraction. And that same process happened with many of the abandoned ideas that were previously only drawings, like Ken Anderson's Hanging Man concept. X initially played around with a redesign, but ultimately just took the original version and put it in the stretching room, adding to the scene that Mark Davis had already created. Even the moving bust effect, which had mostly been forgotten about, would suddenly find new life inside the portrait gallery. Really, it was the inclusion of leftover concepts like these that really gave the ride its eclectic vibe that people love so much. Had Davis or Coates gotten their way, the attraction might be more so centered around their ideas, and not as random and interesting as it turned out to be. Even Rolly Crump's Museum of the Weird, which had since been thrown out by Disney's new management, would still have a few elements of it incorporated into the mansion, mainly through certain design elements. Once all these pieces were in place, X began to assemble a script that would reflect the ride's new backstory, deciding it would feature some kind of host that narrated each scene as you went through it, with one of his initial ideas for the host being a demonic one-eyed cat.
All happy haunts, except for that unnatural and dreadful one-eyed black cat. Watch out for him. He detests mortals, especially happy mortals.
Eventually, that idea was replaced by a raven narrating the ride, which most would argue was not one of the better ideas.
And I have found very early soundtracks that have the raven as narrator. Well, it's really obnoxious. Whoever did the voicing, it was almost as though it was a human voicing a raven. So it was as though you were reading and it said, caw, caw. He took the coward's way out. Caw.
Caw, caw. He chose the coward's way. Caw.
And even though the talking raven was ultimately scrapped in favor of the disembodied ghost host, the actual bird can still be seen throughout the ride, presumably where he would have talked. X would then go on to work with voice actor Paul Frees on all his lines for the ghost host, slowly reworking the original script into what the final narration would become.
Lurking at your side is an unseen ghost, gently pushing you back into your carriage, urging you to stay.
I would actually encourage any hardcore Haunted Mansion fans out there to listen to the full recording session if you haven't, since there are tons of little differences between it and what we can hear today. Plus, it's always fun to hear what people were saying back in 1969.
How much time more do I have?
Oh, you got another 5 seconds, 8
Oh,
seconds.
oh, that's like giving whiskey to an Indian. God bless you. I don't even want the money today.
Whoa, Paul, come on, you can't say that. Hashtag not my ghost host.
Strike that last part.
Glad we're recording that last line.
Yeah.
It was around this same time that all of the other music and audio elements of the attraction were recorded. Everything from Gaylord Carter's iconic organ playing that can be heard throughout the attraction, to all of the sound effects created by Jimmy McDonald were finalized, giving the mansion its signature sound, which was just as important in setting its tone as all the visuals were. But one of the more important pieces of music was the song for its graveyard scene. Since the ride was planned to end on a musical note like Pirates was, the ride would then have its famous Grimsgrinning Ghost song written and composed by X Atencio and Buddy Baker, who also unintentionally spawned another great piece of the attraction, the singing busts, an effect they decided to include after seeing how well the actual singers looked together as a group, now reusing the same effect that was previously only used for Madame Leota, where they would project each of their faces onto a bust. Now with just about everything finally set up for the attraction, and the actual construction of its scenes completed, the ride would officially open on August 9th of 1969. It's funny to think about now, but at the time of its opening, the mansion had been one of the most anticipated attractions ever. Since it had just been mysteriously sitting there for the past 6 years, the response when its gates did open was bigger than anything Disneyland had seen before, really solidifying it as a park favorite, and that same sentiment can still be seen today, more than 50 years later. Honestly, we wouldn't know just how much the attraction evolved if it wasn't so popular, since fans of the mansion have spent years digging through its history to piece together all these abandoned concepts, especially websites like Long Forgotten Haunted Mansion and Doom Buggies, both of which were a great help in making this video, so be sure to check them out. And while it might be sad to think about everything that was left behind, good ideas for the mansion never really die. A great example of that happening only a few years later with the Magic Kingdom's version of the ride, where some older concepts got repurposed. For example, Claude Coats got the opportunity to redesign its facade with more of a gothic style that better matched his first half of the ride, and Mark Davis was able to use some of his extra changing portraits in the form of a new scene where they follow you with their eyes. So don't lose hope. Disney does have a tendency of reintroducing abandoned ideas, and they've done so recently. Who really knows what could be coming back to the ride over the next decade? Either way, thanks everybody for making it to the end of this video. A little bit longer than normal, so I do appreciate you hanging in there. And if you like these longer format videos and want to see more of them on a regular basis, you can help by supporting the channel, either directly through Patreon or by getting yourself one of our great new t-shirts featuring some of the fathers of the mansion. A nice little way to pay homage to some of the Imagineers behind the attraction. So with that said, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and I should be seeing you all a little later.
Well, there you have it, our fromage de Halloween.
Scott, that's supposed to be homage.
Thank you.